Okay, well, we might get going. Thanks for those that have joined, and there's a few people that will trickle in over the next few minutes. But welcome. The Howard Andrews not-for-profit practice has the privilege of working with a cross-section of the not-for-profit sector, with organisations doing some amazing work. And what we also see is organisations facing similar challenges and who would often benefit from sharing their experiences, hearing what others are doing. So this webinar, which we've done for quite a number of years now, has been a forum for those conversations. And this year, very pleased to have join us to have that conversation, Trudy Ma from Empower, who will be giving us some insights into some of the big issues her organisation is facing up to, and also Phil Butler, the not-for-profit sector lead from the Australian Institute of Company Directors, who we'll also hear from shortly. Welcome to you both. I'll provide a more detailed intro shortly. On the call today, we have representatives from a broad range of organisations, small and large, not-for-profits and charities. All being well, we'll have some time at the end for questions, so please do pop any queries or questions or comments you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And yeah, we'll have 15 minutes or so at the end to do that. And before hearing from Trudy and Phil, as I mentioned, we have the privilege of seeing across large and small not-for-profits of different sizes and with different missions. And this gives us a great insight into some of the issues that are common across the industry from a legal perspective. Perhaps the most common theme we have seen in the last 12 months or so has sort of, I guess, the underlying theme of fundraising. Where does revenue come from? You know, pressures from government policy, and a nod to the disability sector here, compliance costs, particularly in places like aged care, and also I think a very different and changing fundraising landscape has meant not-for-profits are seeking alternatives to traditional revenue sources. And I think this is aligned quite nicely with some broader thinking within the sector that we're seeing about what a not-for-profit actually does, particularly in relation to commercial activities. I guess it's that old not-for-profit misnomer. You can and should make a profit or a surplus, because otherwise how are you going to run? You just can't distribute it to members. And some of the more fun bits of work we've done the last 12 months or so have been when organisations have been really proactively seeking to diversify their funding sources by moving into some more or alternative commercial type activities, you know, pushing the boundaries of what a social enterprise might look like. And I guess the challenge being that commercial activities is both operationally challenging, but also potentially legally restricted in some cases. And we've certainly seen an uptick in work around the structuring, the governance and commercial arrangements relating to those different types of activities. I think the other key theme we've seen come out of our work relates to, I guess, the continuing appetite for new charities and not-for-profits. There remain lots of people wanting to contribute to society by establishing and running a charity. And interestingly, this is aligned with an uptick of activity with the regulator as well. So the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission has been busy the last 12 months. They've issued a number of updated interpretation statements, including for health promotion charities and most recently in the last few weeks for public benevolent institutions. And certainly we can attest to, I guess, a greater level of scrutiny from the ACNC around granting of charity status, in particular where DGR registration is sought. And I think overall we see this as a good thing, that rigour to the application process, which perhaps wasn't there a few years ago, has meant that new organisations are ready to go, I guess, have thought about a few more things before they hit the ground. And lastly, I guess I think it's a bit of an emerging issue. Those submitting their annual activity statements with the ACNC will have seen the updated requirements in relation to related party transactions. Those operating through a public company structure will already be familiar with those requirements in relation to financial benefits. However, the ACNC is really now focusing on a broader set of relationships for registered charities. So arrangements between the charity and related parties, be that directors or members and their families, is caught by these requirements, which at the moment is limited to sort of identification of those, some transparency, some good governance around them, and some reporting on them. But particularly for smaller organisations that are established and operated by, for example, family members or charities that rely on assets like land or services provided by a director or a related party, these new rules, I guess, turn a bit of a light and a focus on the governance around those arrangements. And that's really it from me. There's sort of some of the broader themes we've seen over the last 12 months in our practice. And in the past, for those that have attended this seminar before, we've really enjoyed and valued hearing from others in the industry. So I'd like to, I guess, formally introduce Trudy Ma, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Empower, and which has provided community support services out of Warrnambool since, I think, 1975, if I'm correct, including particularly in the disability space. Trudy is responsible for the operations team at Empower, with a very small portfolio of culture, finance, plan management, IT, quality, risk and business support. Quite the job description. And thank you, Trudy, for coming along and I guess sharing some of your journey over the last 12 months and some of the big issues facing Empower in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me and inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit of our journey over the last couple of years. As Paul mentioned, I am the Chief Operating Officer at Empower, and I've been in the role for since June 2021, so just over 2 years, and sort of have a background in community services, and in my mid-20s sort of fell into HR type roles, and that sort of began my journey of being in those sort of more business and corporate services roles. As Paul mentioned, I do oversee all of those corporate services functions, as well as sort of taking the lead on one of the big things that I'll talk to you today about. So to give a bit more broader context of who Empower are, we were up until really recently a dual sector not-for-profit organisation across the whole of Southwest Victoria. We have our largest base in Warrnambool, and we also have additional premises in Portland and Hamilton with huge amounts of service delivery across 5 LGAs. So initially working in the early years in disability, providing playgroups, toy libraries, basically based around a group of people who identified a need for those with disabilities. We've grown to a full range of services, providing allied health services to people with disabilities up to the age of 18. We provide one-on-one and group sessions to people with disabilities of all ages, and we have our plan management services. And then not more recently, but a few years into our operations, we became very involved in community services sector. So we have a large volume of programs offered that are largely government funded, like integrated family services, support for carers, and out-of-home care being our biggest programs. And this full suite of offerings allows people who come into our service to have that wraparound support for families. And our purpose, we think, is a really clear and simple one, which is to support individuals and communities to reach their full potential. So moving right up to sort of 2021, a new CEO came into Empower after the previous CEO had been in place for about 20 years. And so at that time, he brought me in as Chief Operating Officer. And along with the board, we sought to really not so much have a new purpose or have a new direction, but rather get to where we wanted to be in a different way. We found there was a real need to shift our focus from day to day and what we did for clients and participants to how we could really future-proof ourselves against unknown changes within the sectors. to look at a split between our revenue, it was probably 40% block funded by largely state government and 60% on a fee for service through the NDIS. And we knew we were one of very many not-for-profits within the disability and community services sector that were quite vulnerable. We had to first go through a bit of a culture shift from thinking of ourselves as an organization who didn't focus on finance, and we filtered all decisions through the good we could do and the families that we could support, no matter the cost, in order to meet that purpose of supporting individuals and communities to reach their full potential. And the community services sector is an interesting one because people have to remain the core of everything you do, but we had to blend that thinking. So we changed it to, in order to be in a position where we could meet our purpose and filter our decisions through the good we can do and the families we support without having to think of finances, we had to set ourselves up to be financially sustainable and to be far less reliant on government funding and policy of the day. So we needed to look at what business decisions we had to make that had the least impact on service delivery whilst also pushing forward into the future. So we underwent significant consultation through a strategic planning process. We spoke to our staff, our families, we supported external stakeholders, other organizations. It was the largest piece of consultation we've done, I think, in our history. And we wanted to look at our service offerings over the next 3, 5, and 10 years and where we wanted to be. And from there, we really identified 3 major themes that came to us. The first one was, as anybody who would work in a complex sector, is our workforce. So we have a very varied range of professionals working with us, and we had a very varied range of demographics. And I'll focus slightly on one area of our business, which would be that early childhood intervention and allied health. And we had 2 major demographics. One was a very high and growing number of people in those teams that were over the age of 55. And second highest was a very high percentage of workers between the age of 25 and 35. Our older demographic had been with us for 15 to 20 years. They held all of our background knowledge. They held all of that experience. And we needed to ensure that we retained them and look at how we could stagger those people leaving. Because the very niche role is allied health professionals in regional Victoria working in early childhood intervention and disability. So we're not just looking for a speech pathologist, we're looking for a speech pathologist in a very niche cohort. Then this group of 25 to 35-year-olds identified to us that they really wanted to stay in the workforce, but that childcare was just non-existent. They struggled to their biggest barrier to coming back into the workforce was to get childcare options, sometimes with up to 2-year waiting lists in Warrnambool. And they're the future of our organization. So it was something that we really had to listen to. So we needed a multifaceted approach to recruit and retain a highly skilled workforce. And I can't go through all of those today. But one I wanted to highlight was that strong indication from our teams that one of the things that would keep them connected to the organization was they were fiercely passionate about best practice models, the research, technology, and the cutting edge of where their profession was in order to meet the outcomes for families. And so one such best practice model within our early childhood intervention team was gaining access to children as early as possible in order to identify needs and reduce the number of referrals coming through at school transition, and increasing their capacity. So it's a bit of a note to remember for what I'll bring up in a little while. And our second major theme was the infrastructure that we had at our disposal to provide these services and be where we needed to be. We identified that we needed to build facilities to meet our current and future needs of the participants, particularly in the areas of disability, therapy services, and trauma-informed care. We've been where we are since the 90s, and whilst we have some fabulous spaces for kids and their families, we've actually we've outgrown it. We are now spread across multiple services. So not only did we need somewhere bigger, we needed somewhere that we could bring our workforce back together, because they identified that they wanted a really large collegial support. I think if, dare I mention the word COVID, if COVID taught us anything, people want that connection, and the community services sector thrives on that as well. But also these people who wanted to stay with us, they identified that cutting edge technology, best practice models, they all needed to be there as well. So it was bringing all of that together. And then the third one that all ties this all in together is that real push, and probably the most important one, is that real push to diversify our income. We couldn't build a new building to attract or retain staff. We couldn't have state-of-the-art facilities in order to produce these best practice results. And we can't make our business decision through that lens of our purpose of supporting individuals and families to reach their full potential without the income to support it. So we needed to diversify quite quickly. One area my CEO and I agreed on was the need to be really agile and to move on opportunities that arose quite quickly. But obviously, we're not for profit, all the due diligence and checks and balances along the way to make sure that wasn't a disaster. So with our strategic plan signed off, I think it was February 2022, in March, we started what we thought might be just one of our many ideas that might not come to fruition. But our first idea and the first thing we looked at actually became that 14-month process of where we got to today. We had this spark of an idea almost 2 years ago now. And then it ended in the merger and acquisition of a thriving business into our current operations, as well as the purchase of land and infrastructure to build our new premises on. We also identified that we needed to invest our time in alternative revenue streams. So not just waiting for the government to say, these are the programs we're going to fund, and these are the parameters that we'll fund them in. We wanted to go, this is the need in the community, this is where we need funded, and we went and sourced that funding ourselves. And then finally, we really, in the diversification of funding, the key step in all of that was, as great as all that could be, if our staff didn't understand finance, then there would be significant hurdles even as we move forward. So that real investment into our staff and our management teams to work with us building those budgets and monitoring those budgets and tracking them, something that had been confined to a small executive and management team until then. So over that 14-month period, we engaged in what I can only describe as one of the most challenging yet rewarding projects that I've ever been involved in. We purchased and began operating a 103-place childcare and kindergarten centre in Warrnambool, with our first day of delivery being in April this year. As Paul alluded to, there was huge amounts of governance and structure discussions that had to occur in that not-for-profit space. So it's now operated by Empower's special purpose not-for-profit company. It has a residential house on there that we run programs out of it, and it also has land there for us to build on. I could spend probably an entire 3 hours talking about all of the ins and outs of the legalities and the governance structures and charity bits and pieces that we had to go through to get where we are. But all I'll say probably today is that for an organization of our size and an organization of our resourcing, I think the volume of work that was pulled off in order to get to where we are today was just magnificent. So what we then look at is we're here now 6 months into operation. And I think writing this up for today really gave me that opportunity to go, hang on, let's go back and look at why we did it in the first place, and where we needed to be and how we needed to position ourselves, and did we get there? So what we identified are 3 themes of workforce, infrastructure, and that diversification of income. And what we can see now is we have on-site childcare facilities for our staff. So we have reduced the barriers for our staff to return to work. Again, those wait times in Warrnambool are 2 years, at least for childcare. We have a thriving business in that childcare centre that's making surpluses, which are reinvested back into Empower as the parent company. And these funds are used to fund both the work that we do with our families, that we see value in that may not necessarily be funded. And they will also help in the construction of that building that will be there with that latest technology and that state-of-the-art community hub to have all of Empower's services back on one site, reuniting a large portion of our workforce and moving towards that cohesive culture. Thirdly, when we build the hub, we will be working in what's considered the very best practice in the field of early childhood intervention by having our therapists in there and identifying any concerns as early as potentially 6 months. This model, if it was implemented, the plan being if it was implemented Australia-wide, you could see a vast reduction in referrals coming through at school transition, which would mean that the very limited resources that we have in allied health in early childhood intervention would be where they most need to be. And this meets our workforce goal of our staff working in the latest research and best practice models. And then when we build the hub, the plans are ready to submit to council this week, I hope. And our plan is to build an indoor play centre, something that Warrnambool doesn't have, and an on-site cafe for the community to bring the community in, which creates 2 further income, additional revenue streams and further diversification of our income. Most importantly, if we go back to the very first thing that I spoke about, we wanted to shift our thinking and the way we do business. And in order to be in a position where we can filter every one of our decisions through the good we can do and to meet our purpose of supporting individuals and communities to reach their full potential, we needed to set ourselves up to be financially sustainable and less reliant on government funding and policy of the day. We think we're well on our way there. We know that it's a long-term plan and we'll see the full results unfold over the next few years. But all signs are pointing towards us having some great decisions having been made at Empower over the last couple of years to set us up to be a thriving, sustainable, future-focused organisation with a committed and engaged workforce. I'm pretty excited about where Empower is going, and I'm really excited to work in the not-for-profit space, and it giving us these opportunities to be able to do this, something that I didn't think I'd be working in 2 years ago. And I'm really happy with the results. And that's the crux of what I had to talk about today, Paul, but thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to everyone about this.
Fantastic, and thank you, Trudy. The way you describe it, that very detailed and in-depth process makes it sound easy, and I know it wasn't. There's a lot underneath there, and there's probably a lot of questions that people might have. Certainly I have. So if you've got any questions for Trudy, pop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. But thank you very much for running through that. It was a fantastic summary. Moving to Phil Butler. Phil has led the not-for-profit project at the AICD since 2011. Which is designed to support organisations in the not-for-profit sector to achieve their respective missions through ongoing improvements in governance. You will no doubt be familiar with some of Phil's work, which includes the good governance principles and guidance for NFP organisations, and also, if you haven't heard of it, you will very shortly, the NFP Governance Performance Study, and the survey that is done of the industry, which Phil will be talking about today. I've had the benefit of seeing some of this content before from Phil, which is really interesting. I hope you find it valuable in terms of a bit of a snapshot of what the industry is doing. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Paul, and lovely to catch up with everyone today. I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully that's working. Paul, you can see that all right? Beautiful. So AICD's purpose is to strengthen society through world-class governance, and I have the absolute pleasure to lead the not-for-profit sector work that we're doing. It includes a range of resources, but I'm going to particularly pick up today on the NFP governance study, which we launched back in March, but I think the findings are still quite relevant for today. I'm going to flick through them at a reasonably quick pace, and we can have Q&A at the end of the end of the presentation. Now, let me see if I can get that working. There we go. AICD is a large member-based organisation, over 50,000 members, but a high proportion of them are involved in the not-for-profit sector. We had just over 2,000 responses to the survey, 2,300. Interestingly, important to recognise, almost a third come from larger not-for-profits, turning over greater than 20 million. I make that point deliberately because some of the themes you'd say, okay, probably resonate across all, but once you get into things like remuneration of directors, you can get a sense of, okay, that's probably at the larger end of town. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The survey itself, well distributed across the countryside. So key finding one was around measurement of effectiveness. And we've looked at this almost every year. Organisations, the directors say, our organisation's very effective in achieving its outcome. I'm sure that's true, but we're also curious as to how that is done. And I think we saw for the first time this year, perhaps, that as a sector, we've got a little way to go in measuring impact. So a lot of the ways of measuring came out from CEO reports. Now, that's not to say CEO reports aren't important, but what does that mean actually in terms of measuring impact in your purpose? So I'm mindful there, it's challenging for the not-for-profit sector often to have the resources devoted to measurement of overarching impact. I'm also mindful of the complexity of it. AICD is a perfectly good example of that. Our purpose to strengthen society through world-class governance. How do we go about measuring that? It's a big picture vision, right? So some real challenges in measuring impact. I won't labour the point, but we are developing some more resources around this to try and assist not-for-profits to better measure that impact. And we ran a webinar the other day, which was very insightful on this particular topic. And that resource will be available to members and non-members once it gets launched in 3 or 4 weeks' time. The second of the findings was, we're calling it the changing nature of governance. And there's a lot to unpack in that. First of all, almost half spending 3 days or more on a single not-for-profit as a non-executive director. That's a lot of time directors are spending on governing their not-for-profit. 22% were remunerated. This is the first time we've seen it at that sort of level. We've tracked this for about a decade now, and it's slowly increased from 13%, 14%, up to now 22%. What we're not saying that 22% of not-for-profit directors are remunerated. I think that would be totally false. What we're saying is 22% of our respondents, and remember that they are on larger organisations as a general rule. And of course, the larger the organisation, the more likely they are to be remunerated. One particular area that we wanted to explore this year on the back of, I guess, various Royal Commissions, but obviously Aged Care Royal Commission that had reported a couple of years earlier, and of course the ongoing Disability Royal Commission, which is now just reported, was how do directors actually understand the quality of care being provided to care recipients? And for those of you who did look into the Disability Royal Commission, and I read some of the transcripts, there were some pretty harrowing stories, right? Similarly with the Aged Care Royal Commission. We were a little surprised that when we asked about what was their primary source of information, again, CEO and management reports rated very highly. Obviously, some close monitoring of the board, and I'll reflect back on that in a moment. Only 11% said care committees was their primary source of information. Didn't say that they didn't have care committees. And of course, for aged care organisations, I think by last December, it meant that they had to have them established. It's not saying they didn't have them, but they weren't using that as their primary source of information. So again, kind of an interesting finding in terms of that implications and expectations of community and society, that directors will have a really good knowledge of the care being provided. And we saw that loud and clear in the Aged Care Royal Commission findings, that that was an expectation, that directors would really know what was going on. Of course, as a non-executive director, and if you're on a larger NFP that might have multiple sites, multiple campuses, how do you actually have that real understanding of what's going on? How are you hearing about the bad news? How quickly does that travel up the chain so that you as a board know what's going on? And I think that adds a real challenge to directors now in fulfilling their roles and meeting those expectations. And we expect that our loved ones are going to be looked after properly, right? Whether it's aged care or disability or childcare or whatever it might be. So I think some real challenges for directors in this space. We've heard a little bit about financials already from Paul and Trudy, and everything you've said, I think, resonates to what we heard. We've seen decreased profitability over the years that we've run this study. And it's considerably challenged there in financials. Those in social services, residential aged care, really struggling to make a profit. And as the former ACNC commissioner once said, profit is not a dirty word. Organisations do need to make a profit to build that sustainable future, and we expect them to do that. And at the moment, you can see that that is a real challenge for many. But here's the flip side to that. Despite all of that loss making and barely breaking even, the ongoing optimism of our director community. 73% still said their organisation was going to be financially stronger in 3 years' time. Now, we've had similar optimism each year, and yet we've seen declining profitability. So, as I often joke, I think the directors perhaps looking a little bit through rose-coloured glasses, or maybe you've just got to have that eternal optimism if you're going to stay as a not-for-profit director, because we know it's challenging. Finding 4, perhaps not so much of a finding as simply to say mergers just were not on the radar of organisations. Again, kind of surprising, given all of the challenges that organisations are facing, both financially, that they're facing in terms of meeting the expectations of society, yet only 5% were undertaking a merger, and only 19% actually looking at doing a merger. So having those discussions about mergers. So this has been a bit of a slow burn. I've been waiting to see this change, to see mergers more on the radar, but currently not seeing it from our survey. Again, picking up on some of the stuff that Trudy was talking about there, top priorities. We could have written this together, Trudy. Workforce planning, diversifying income sources, a bit of a focus there on tracking progress as well. I must admit, from the roadshow we did earlier this year and as I talk to not-for-profits across Australia, the workforce is such a big challenge for everyone. And that has all sorts of implications, including competition amongst each other for staff, looking at what you need to do, whether that is building a childcare facility that is both for your staff as well as a revenue-making source. It's a really big issue, and I think will remain so for a while to come. Diversifying income sources is a fascinating one, because I look back at the last couple of years of profitability during COVID, and funnily enough, the organisations that hadn't diversified their income and were more reliant on government income actually did much better, because that government funding saved them in that extraordinary time. However, boards are thinking into the future and looking at that need to diversifying income sources, while still making sure that the organisation is doing what its purpose is there to be. So not getting into that whole area of mission creep or going down paths that don't meet the purpose. And I think that is one of the balancing acts. And if I just touch on the final point there about improving board composition, I think that's a really interesting one, particularly for those who are in the business of providing care. How do we get the right people on the board who are prepared to wear the risks? And gee, if I look at the new recommendations under aged care, there are high risks and expectations that board members need to have. How do you get that right diversity on the board to actually meet the expectations of our society? Again, I think a real challenge there, and perhaps an even bigger challenge sometimes in rural and regional Australia. And we can chat about that a bit later on as well, if you'd like. We asked some questions, I think, for the first time around climate change and ESG. Yes, it was on the board agendas, but perhaps not as much as we had expected. We also saw a bit of a vote of confidence that 60%, thought we had the knowledge and experience to deal with climate governance issues. Again, I hope that's with the appropriate thought through the question, and not just saying, yeah, we'll be fine, thanks very much, but we will wait and see on that. That's probably the key areas that I wanted to go through today. I span through that a little bit quicker than when I'm doing it face to face, but that means we've got some more time for the panel chatting and taking some Q&A from across the airwaves. So I'll stop sharing at that point. There we go.
Fantastic, and making sure I'm on mute. Thank you, Phil. As ever, it's always interesting to get a sense from, I guess, an industry-wide perspective on some of the issues, and the, like any survey, the questions you ask often drive the results, but they also, I guess, drive the thinking as well when you're looking at them. Do we fit into any of these buckets, and what might be in them? Now, as I said, please pop in any questions, queries, or comments you have into the Q&A box, and we'll see what we can do in terms of a conversation or a response to them. To kick things off, though, I thought I might make a question around the that question of diversification is probably to both of you in a way. Diversification has a flip side. Obviously, your comment there, Phil, around those that are diversified actually did financially worse than those that hadn't, which is all a bit counterintuitive. But of course, we do this for a strategic reason. But it does also raise that question of when we diversify our revenue streams, that's great. It reduces our reliance perhaps on government funding, but it also introduces I guess, a bit like what you call normal business risks, you know, economic cycle goes up and down, etc. I mean, Trudy, how did that conversation go? That flip side of diversification at a board level. What was sort of some of the thoughts from Empower in relation to going down that path?
I think we're looking at probably doing it in a bit of a safe way, where we're not looking to reduce any of the current funding streams. We're not looking to replace the funding from the government with the diversification we want to add to. And those programs that we're currently funded for and the way we're funded for are really important. But for us, it was more of a risk not to diversify than it would be to not divert. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. It would be more of a risk not to. So if we look at NDIS, I think and I'll just use allied health as an example, because I discussed it. There's anybody who works in the NDIS knows that there's a price guide and there's price caps. The price guide, or the price book for the line for allied health professionals, has not increased in 6 years. But everything else has exponentially. And so when you're working in a not-for-profit, and again, going back to people are at the heart of everything that we do, and our board is looking at that as well, balancing that need to keep that program in our community when it is not financially viable as it stands as a program funded by the NDIS. We need to diversify in order to keep that. So it was less of a risk to stay the same.
And Trudy, can I jump in there, because it's fascinating, right? So a lot of not-for-profits have kept on doing things that probably a for-profit would stop doing. And they're the really tough conversations around a board table, right? Of, should we stop doing those things which are becoming completely unfinancial? And my take, the good boards are at least having a conversation around that, as opposed to, you know, sort of head in the sand sort of stuff, and saying, well, what is the level of cross-subsidization, whatever term you want to put to it, to keep doing those services?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it comes back to your measurement conversation as well, Phil. You know, what do we even know what we're cross-subsidizing, or do we need to cross-subsidize, and how are we actually viewing our programs? Are we viewing them as a portfolio when we want an outcome, or do we want each program to stand on its own 2 feet? Really starts linking back to, well, what are the funding sources for each of them as well? So Trudy, to your point, if you can almost use some diversified funding sources to allocate across programs, it makes that conversation a little bit more complex, but I think probably getting to a better outcome ultimately, because you are able to make a call around the economic benefit of each particular program, and also on a portfolio basis.
Yeah, and as Phil said, looking at that level of what is the max, or what is the maximum amount of risk you're willing to take, or what's the maximum deficit you're willing to take before you kind of go, actually. And as long as you're working within those parameters, and you're making sure that, yes, if you're, for lack of a better word, cross-subsidizing, as long as it's not impacting on the organization as a whole, then and the people value and the community value is still high, then you can balance those risks against each other.
Trudy, I was really interested as well in your strategic focus on the staff and as stakeholders, and the feedback that you got from them. I guess I've got 2 questions. First of all, about that consultation, and what came back from that consultation that helped you, and what came back from that consultation that you sort of had to work through as an issue. And then secondly, I'd be interested in your comment around, you made the statement that one of the things that your staff really wanted and was an incentive for them was to work, cutting edge and within best practice models. It's not necessarily intuitively what you'd expect to hear from a staff group in a way. Yeah. It's a lot different to some of the other sort of employment type related issues that you have. So I guess, can you talk us through that process and how it worked?
Yeah, so when we were doing a strategic plan, we we sat down with teams individually in broader departments and the organization as a whole. We sent out one-on-one surveys because we really wanted to get as much feedback, and we were asking different questions around workforce, around infrastructure, around what would keep them. And we do our organizational surveys. The biggest thing that came out was, because we have a really large portion, and it's to do with our cohort potentially of I'm still young enough to say that I'm still in that cohort of people who actively want to be in the workforce but can't get childcare or have to think outside the box. Not sure if you've noticed, but I'm not from here, so I don't have those traditional sort of family methods of being able to get childcare for my kids, and so that idea that we're seeing a real big shift in our male workforce working part-time and our female workers. So there's real shifts in the demographics and the way people are working, the way family units are working, and we're very much for, well, we work with those trends, not against them. And so when we first initially heard on-site childcare as an option, we at no point in that initial theory did we think, let's go and purchase a childcare centre. We thought we would build a small childcare centre within a broader organisation that we would run. But the more we looked into it, it fed into that diversification of funding of it's ready, it's built, it's there, the income's there. We're not having to generate that income. So so that was some of that, and you'll have to keep me on point for your question. So that was how we got that feedback and where we ran with it. There was some crazy feedback of what people wanted, and we couldn't do it all. And so that was interesting in the way we could go back. But I think the key I think I remember clearly one of the board members saying this, because we talked a lot about growth. And it was very clear for the board from the board to us that we weren't growing for growth's sake. We were growing in areas of need and areas that worked well within what we did. So there was that feedback there. And then secondary to that, yes, working in best practice and technology and everything that goes with it probably isn't, high salaries and well-being days and all those other things that you see. We're not immune to that. We get all of that feedback too. But when we've got a cohort of people who want to make regional Victoria their home, they don't want to jeopardize their professional practice just because they're not living in the city. And we don't want to jeopardize our practice or their practice because those children, that community needs that. And if we can show that it's sort of double-pronged, we can keep those people because we are working in that best practice, but we can also then show people who are looking to move regionally that they're not going to lose out on their practice as well.
Fantastic.
Trudy, that is such a fantastic example, and I'd love to have that shouted from the rooftops, because I often think that the not-for-profit sector still suffers from this sort of perspective of it's not cutting edge, it's not sitting on using the best technology, it's still sort of sat back, 20 years behind the rest of the economy. And being able to tell that story that, hey, we are innovative, we're using the best technologies, we're building that really strong workforce for the future, I think is fantastic. So just a shout out to you to keep telling that story as much as possible, because I think it's critically important.
Thank you, Phil.
Phil, that story is also, I think, often has a regional element, i.e. that you're in the country, you're not as good as the city sort of concept. What sort of themes, sort of regional, metropolitan came out of your survey, if any?
So perhaps a couple of things that come out more from the conversations post the actual survey than the survey itself is the subtleties of dealing in governance in rural and regional Australia, where you may not have as well a qualified group of people to, dare I say it, in the old days, tap on the shoulder, hopefully now with a better way of recruiting. One specifically I'm seeing really strongly at the moment is in aged care. Trying to meet those standards crippling some, not just organisations, but communities. And dare I say it, to put some bad news out there, I think we are going to see continued bad news of facilities needing to close down because they just cannot meet those expectations as set out in the Aged Care Royal Commission. And whether that's about hours of care, whether that's about the level of workforce, and I think I heard the stat the other day about the number of beds in aged care that were not being utilised because they could not get workforce to do that. That, to me, as a society, is a bit frightening, and what that might mean. And hey, I'm getting closer to that end, so there's a bit of a personal perspective there as well. I want to have aged care that's going to really look after me in whatever time that's required. So as a society, we've got to get this right. And every time I hear, and we had one, I'm Canberra based, we have one here not far away that had to close down for those reasons. And I think that's really sad because it has a flow-on impact for not just the aged care facility and who's in there, but for the families, the loved ones, and their carers, right? So it is a challenging one that we've got to deal with in Australia.
And interestingly, your survey, as you mentioned during your talk, was done during or shortly after the Royal Commission into Aged Care. There, to flip it back to a governance conversation, was there anything that came out of the responses or the conversations afterwards around what, from a governance point of view, boards can or should be doing about, I guess, some of those underlying issues?
I think the key one, and this is kind of a work in progress. Personal perspective here, I think we saw some real governance failures throughout a number of sectors, and the Royal Commission's highlighted that. Almost that the governance model wasn't fit for purpose. That concept of non-executive director, helicopter view, etc., that the AICD courses have taught for so long. My take is that directors, they don't need to get their hands dirty, but I reckon they need their noses in a lot further to the organisation than perhaps was viewed previously. They need to really understand what's going on. Funnily enough, in some smaller organisations, that might be achievable, because as you walk down the shopping aisle in your rural town, you're more likely to bump into the family of the recipients of that aged care and hear the good and the bad news stories, right? The further away you are, the more difficult that is. But directors really need to understand what's going on within that provision of care, and they've got to understand the business model. So this concept of, I'm an independent director, I don't really need to understand the business. Well, that's fine. But if you don't understand how aged care is provided, how do you know if it's being done well or not? How do you understand whether or not we're actually meeting the standards required? And I was chatting with some aged care directors the other day about, well, we're not actually allowed to lock the doors to stop people wandering out. But we've got people with a range of dementia challenges who will go wandering if we don't lock the door. How do we balance that? And how do we have that conversation as board members without delving too much into the detail? So it's complicated, I think, is the quick answer.
It's that is, and there's so much to unpack in there. I did want to follow on probably 2 points. I mean, the first one, I guess, is the question of, are we, because of course, and we take this approach, and I presume the AICD kind of similar, there is a role for a director. It's a strategic role. There are well-trodden mechanisms and forums and ways of going about discharging your duties as a director. Are you, and of course, in the not-for-profit space, arguably there is a greater focus on the beneficiaries or the recipients, and therefore the individuals and the care of that? Are we looking at perhaps almost a dual path skill set for directors, one for more private companies and one for not-for-profits? It's almost like a different skill set, a different expectation requirement here?
It's almost a different expectation requirement, but of course we've got legal structures under Corporations Act that are exactly the same. So I think you raise a fascinating point there, Paul, but I'm always reminded that director I've known for many years from corporate world as well as the aged care sector, and he was referring to just how different it is from when he started as a non-executive director in aged care 15 years ago to the way that meetings are handled now. He said it's just chalk and cheese, and if others haven't followed on that journey and are still doing the things that they did 5 years ago, they're probably not meeting the expectations of society.
I was interesting because I was going to ask about that 3 days per month question, how that compares in the not-for-profit sector versus, I don't know whether you've got the same sort of data for the balance of your membership. Is that a...
We don't, unfortunately, and it's so diverse. Hopefully next year we might be able to do that. But what we've seen is that increasing amount of time.
Fascinating. Because that would be one of the metrics you would use to say, well, are directors getting their noses a little bit deeper into things? Well, yes, they're spending 3 days per month as opposed to one. Is an arguably a good sign, but also I think probably a signal that the role of the director and the expectations that society is starting to set is also changing, which is fascinating.
Absolutely.
We are at the end of the hour, and we haven't had any questions or comments, but we've had a fantastic chat. Thank you, Phil and Trudy. Thank you for everyone who's attended. On behalf of Howard Andrews, I look forward to seeing you at our event next year, and hopefully in the interim. So thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.